Today's video is a compilation of some of the most tragic Everest stories told by this channel so far. The stories we are about to tell include the tragic loss of an expedition leader in a storm, the tragic end of an Australian couple, a mystery on Everest that has lasted for almost 100 years, and finally, two incidents that occurred in the tragic 2023 season. Let's start now. Maria Stridham and Robert Gopal were an adventurous young couple from Australia who decided to set foot on the tallest of all, Mount Everest. They were both very daring and had amazing personalities. Maria Stridham was a 34-year-old lecturer in finance at Monash University in Melbourne. She was an energetic woman who was vegan and wanted to prove the world wrong that vegans aren't weak by climbing some of the most challenging and highest mountains in the world. She pursued her adventurous dream with her husband, Robert Gopal, a fellow vegan and a veterinarian. Before their last journey to Mount Everest, the couple had already climbed the world's highest peaks, including Aconcagua in South America, Denali in North America, Elbrus in Europe, and Kilimanjaro in Africa. That proves the couple were very experienced in enduring the challenges of these rugged mountain terrains. They both were not just simple lovers. They accomplished all of these tasks together, which shows their strong bonds. Maria was not originally an Australian, but a South African who moved to Australia at the age of 11 with her family. She met her lover and climbing partner Robert in university, and after accomplishing so many achievements, the couple planned to climb the peak of heaven. On May 2016, they were finally ready to tackle Everest. They had trained their bodies for years by climbing other challenging mountains, and now they finally had the chance to set history by climbing the tallest mountain in the world. Climbing Everest is no easy task. It offers some of the most challenging obstacles like avalanches, rock slides, hypothermia, fatigue, and countless more, like sickness due to low oxygen levels, which caused the death of the late Maria Stridham. Robert Gopal and Maria Stridham arrived in Nepal in April 2016 and joined an expedition led by Dutch mountaineer Arnold Koster. He was an experienced guide who had led numerous successful expeditions like the one he would do that day. The duo began their journey through the south face of Everest. The route was also first climbed in 1953 by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, who were part of the 9th British expedition to Everest led by John Hunt. The couple climbed Everest slowly as they continued their journey toward the top of Mount Everest. On their way, they stayed at each camp and faced many difficulties, which was pretty much expected, but everything was going pretty normal till they reached Camp 3. They spent a day at Camp 3 and were about to enter what everyone calls the death zone. The team reached Camp 4 on Friday, 20th May 2016. They had to start their journey when it was still dark because they had to be fast at this point onwards, with only 15 hours on the clock, and needed to climb up to cross the death zone, reach the summit, and climb back down. Undoubtedly a very tough challenge. The couple is now at the highest of 7,900 meters at this point. They had to be quick yet calm because here, the higher you go, your survival timer ticks even faster. Once they reached 8,000 meters, the death zone officially began. At this point, the sky turned dark blue and oxygen levels were extremely low. On top of that, the extra oxygen tanks and equipment added weight that slowed them down even more. As they ascended, they were getting closer to their dream of reaching the summit. They crossed many landmarks, such as the South Summit, the balcony, and the Hillary Step. At this point, the summit was right in front of their eyes, and it was when tragedy started showing its signs, and the worst thing happened. Maria suddenly started to feel sick and seemed sluggish, according to Arnold. Robert thought she was exhausted, so she stopped just a few hundred meters away from the summit. But little did he know his wife was suffering from altitude sickness. Robert asked Maria for permission to carry on his journey without her, which she agreed with and stayed behind and waited for her husband to return. Robert successfully finished his journey and reached the summit. But according to him in an interview, he didn't feel the same happiness and joy that he felt with his wife because they both did everything together. But this time, she was not with him. Robert didn't want to separate from her, but the summit was not far from where he left his wife, so he continued his journey. Maria descended to a lower altitude and waited for her husband. Her condition was worsening at this point, and she needed immediate medical attention. With her crew, Maria ascended down, and halfway towards the balcony, she became very weak, even to move. They barely managed to reach the South Col due to her worsening condition. They decided to camp there and continued their journey into the morning to reach Camp 3, where rescue helicopters could reach for help. The next morning, Maria could move on her own, but only after 2 hours away from the camp, she collapsed near the Geneva Spur. That's where she took her last breath in her husband's arms. It was a tragic moment for everyone, especially for Robert, but the crew had to leave her body behind for survival reasons and continue the journey. The next day, the crew was rescued by a helicopter and were taken to a hospital in Kathmandu. Robert suffered many injuries during the retrieval, but luckily he survived and could make a quick recovery, but that didn't recover him from losing his wife. He stayed in Nepal and didn't leave the country until he got his wife's body back. Maria's body was luckily recovered from the mountains thanks to the hard work of rescue teams who risked their lives to recover it. The body was transferred to Robert in Kathmandu. Along with Maria Stridham, there was another casualty from the same crew of a man named Eric Arnold, who died in his sleep after successfully reaching the summit along with Robert and the other crew members. The victim's family heavily criticized Arnold Koster, but in truth, it was nobody's fault. Robert blames himself for the death of his wife, even though he knows climbing Everest was risky. Everest is so tall that 4 levels of pure climbing have killed many experienced climbers. The first camp you encounter on your journey is a base camp located at 5,400 meters, 17,700 feet. These camps provide you with tents and supplies to assist you on your journey. With them, climbing Everest becomes a little easier. Reaching the base camp is relatively easy, and it's your first achievement afterwards. You need to be prepared because you're about to cross the icefall. It's a place where you're always in danger, and it's completely located at the height of 5,500 meters to 6,100 meters, 18,000 feet to 20,000 feet. Anything can happen here, from a crevice opening under you to an ice pinnacle that can fall on top of you. Luckily, if you survive the icefall, you're welcomed by Camp 1, Valley of Silence, at 6,100 meters to 6,400 meters, 20,000 to 21,000 feet. This is where the true challenges start. When you reach Camp 1, you're completely isolated, and other than your voice, all you can hear is a cold wind and the terrifying sound of nearby avalanches. This area is covered in endless snow. Sleeping at night is just another task because you can hear cracking sounds from under your tent all night. These are the sounds of crevices opening and closing deep down in the glacier beneath. Aside from all the terrifying things you experience here, you can also focus on the first sight of Everest. At 6,400 meters, 21,000 feet, you reach Camp 2. It's a beautiful place where you're welcomed by all the stunning sceneries, making you forget all the potential dangers that lie ahead. Here, you kind of recharge your body and use the advanced climbing gears left by the previous climbers. At this point, you start to feel the low oxygen due to high altitudes. Camp 3, Lhotse Wall, is a final camp before the death zone and is located at 6,800 meters to 8,000 meters, 22,300 feet to 26,300 feet. It's a part where you start to feel like giving up because it's dangerous and takes away all of your strength due to oxygen deficiencies. A euphoria-like state is created where your body feels weak even to do small tasks, and your sense of danger becomes extremely low. It's a point where you can either turn back or risk your life to reach the summit. When you reach the 4th camp, the last camp, the death zone begins. The name itself depicts what lies ahead from this point on. Located at 8,000 meters, 26,000 feet, you come incredibly close to the summit, and you have only 15 hours maximum to reach the summit from Camp 4 and come back down. If you're not prepared and are low on oxygen, then climbing the death zone is like calling for death because it's a place where only professionals and fully prepared climbers can survive. So if you haven't done your homework, then start climbing back down. On Everest, the conditions can turn against you in a millisecond, and you must be fully prepared to tackle such situations. If you're not trained, then you might even become a problem for your crew members, which means if you're stuck in an awful place, your crew might leave you behind. That's why Everest lives up to its name, where it's the survival of the fittest. As we conclude the tragic story of these Australian couples, we get to see how strong and loving people can be. The duo was faithful to each other, did everything together, and faced all the challenges head on. They were determined to do the impossible, even if it had to be the goal of reaching the top of the tallest mountain in the world. It was a story of love and bravery. Rest in peace, Maria Stridham. All condolences go to the family. Her story will be remembered as a legend of Mount Everest. It was early May of 1996 when Rob, along with a team of 8 paid clients mountaineers and 3 guides, decided to ascend Mount Everest. Rob had climbed Everest more than 5 times, so he was already experienced and knew of the possible conditions they could face. But since the weather seemed clear in May, it was out of the question to face any hazardous conditions. Rob was leading the expedition, as it was arranged by his own company, now known as Adventurers Consultant. Everything seemed to go perfectly fine. His team included 3 Americans, Doug Hansen, John Krakauer, and Beck Weathers. John was a journalist from the Outside magazine. He was there for a task rather than the ascent, in exchange for advertising space and a feature about the rising popularity of commercial Everest climbs. Outside had agreed to let Hall lead John, one of the reporters, to the summit. One of the things in John's life that he still curses because of the post-trauma stress that he still has. At the time when Hall's team was on the expedition to Everest, 3 other teams were on the same route. There were climbers from Scott Fisher's Mountain Madness Company, a group from Taiwan, and another group of members from India. On May 10th, things started getting worse as Beck, who was a team member of Hall's expedition, started losing his vision because of the UV rays. Also, he previously had a corneal surgery, which contributed to his fatal condition to abandon the expedition. The trip suddenly got postponed. The climbers were forced to wait an hour while the guide set up the ropes at the Hillary Step because there was no fixed queue there when they arrived. Being the team leader, Rob fixed the ropes. This also took a long time for them to reach the summit of Everest in the expected time. As there were 3 expedition teams, including 33 members, who were summiting Mount Everest at the same time, so Rob and Fisher asked the mountaineers to stay close by 150 meters to each other, as this will help them to be on track and reach the summit successfully. But this created bottlenecks along the way of Hillary Step. The tight deadline for the climb began to slacken due to the large number of climbers moving at once and the time required to place additional ropes. With everyone running an hour behind schedule, reaching the top by the targeted time of 2 p.m. was suddenly impossible. It was possible to return to the camp before it got dark, as they were reaching the summit after 2 p.m. Hall was worried for the safety of team members, but it seemed as if luck was not on their side. As the group was approaching the peak of Mount Everest, Hansen started feeling nauseated, and his disposition was getting bad minute by minute. There remains an unanswered question in the aftermath of the disaster. Why did Hall not cancel the expedition when they missed the tight deadline of 2 p.m. to ascend Mount Everest? Why did he continue to the summit? There is a 2 o'clock rule for all mountaineers. The 2 o'clock rule said the climbers should abandon their summit attempt and head back to the safety of the camp if they were unable to reach the summit by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The leaders and/or guides should tell the climbers to turn around if he doesn't comply. But unfortunately, many of the climbers decided to go against it and ascend Mount Everest anyway. This was a mistake. Hall reached Mount Everest peak at around 2:10 p.m., and there he waited for his team member, Hansen, to join him. The weather was showing the bad side, and it started turning gray everywhere, as if a storm was on its way. Hall Sardar, Ang Dorji Sherpa, and other climbing Sherpas, who had already conquered Mount Everest, awaited the clients at the peak. They began their descent shortly before 3:30 p.m. On the way down from the Hillary Step, Ang Dorji came across customer Doug Hansen and instructed him to go down, but Hansen refused. The reason he didn't want to abandon the ascent when he was this close was that, exactly 1 year back, he was climbing the south summit with Hall. But Hall turned Hansen down to descend because of the bad weather, and so this time, Hansen was adamant not to leave this goal in between. Now it was only Rob Hall on the peak of Mount Everest, waiting for his friend and team member, Hansen, to join him so they could descend together. It was now around 4 p.m. By the time Hansen arrived, his extra oxygen had run out, and they had stayed on the summit for an hour longer than planned. Hall made the brave choice to stay with Hansen even though he knew it would be fatal. He gave the other climbers instructions to help the other Sherpas get back to camp as he continued their descent. Hansen had no energy left in him to descend back to the base camp, as all his strength and supplemental oxygen were used on his way to ascend the mountain. Hall didn't leave Hansen's side and tried hard to keep him going. When they both reached the top of the Hillary top, things got worse as Hall was not able to get Hansen down the 40 vertical drop. Around 5 p.m., a blizzard slammed the southwest face of Everest, reducing visibility and destroying the way back to Camp 4. Soon after, Hall radioed for help, saying Hansen had lost consciousness but was still alive. They were high above the ridge and instantly needed oxygen. Andy Harris, Adventure Consultant's leader, began his journey to the Hillary Step at 5:30 p.m., carrying water and supplementary oxygen to both of them. At around 2:53 p.m., Cotter, who was a climbing partner of Hall and Harris, was guiding another team on Mount Pumori near Mount Everest. He was tracking the radio transmission of Rob all day. He asked Rob to descend to the south summit and try to get some gas. It was their only way back to the base camp, safe and sound. Rob told him that he was not able to move Hansen and would not leave him alone. Rob stayed with Hansen for around an hour. It was 11th May, 1996, at around 4:43 a.m., when almost 12 hours after the blizzard had started, that Hall remained stuck near the south summit. He radioed down that he was on the south summit. He claimed that Harris had reached the two men, but Hansen had passed away overnight, and Harris had vanished as well. No one knows what happened to Hansen. After research, his ice axe was found in a jammed ridge above the sheer face of the trench where he might have fallen. Despite Hall's selfless motive to save Hansen, he failed. Hall, too, was not in a good state. Hansen achieved his dream of climbing Mount Everest, but sadly at the cost of his life. Hall's condition wasn't good as his oxygen regulator was clogged with ice, so he wasn't using bottled oxygen. Hall didn't want to put any other mountaineer at risk, so he kept on telling his team at the base camp that he was fine. We wish he was, but it was not so. It seemed as if time was running out of his hands. He finally got the oxygen to work after 5 hours of trying, but by then, the cold had won the war. Frostbite had damaged his hands and feet badly. He was on the verge of losing it all and couldn't move the ropes any longer. At around 9:30 a.m., two of the brave mountaineers, Ong Dorji and Lok Pahiri, decided to rescue Rob. They left the South Col and started climbing the south summit with a thermos of hot tea and 2 extra canisters of supplemental oxygen. The weather was harsh, but they were determined to get to Hall and take him back with them. They were cold to the core, but kept going. However, it didn't go for long, as around 3 p.m., when they were still 700 feet away from the south summit, the wind went wild and the temperature was beyond their expectations. So they decided to move back to the base camp. It was a serious attempt by the two, but they failed, and with that, they lost all hope of seeing Hall alive ever again. The last time Hall was heard was in the afternoon when he contacted the base camp. He radioed base camp and asked them to make a satellite phone call to his wife, Jan Arnold. His last words to her were, "Sleep well, my sweetheart," and he assured her that he was perfectly at ease. Please don't worry too much. Soon after that, he passed away. There were attempts made by the team members to get in contact with Hall, but to no avail. There was nothing but sadness and shock in every person to lose such a strong and vibrant personality. He was known as a mountain goat, and on 11 May 1996, they lost him. 12 mountaineers lost their lives that day, including Rob Hall. On 23 May 1996, almost 12 years later, Rob's body was found. 2 mountaineers from the IMX expedition, David Brashears and Ed Vistures, were on their way to climb the south summit of Mount Everest, where they found a dead body lying on the right side of a shallow ice hollow. It was Rob Hall's body. His upper body was buried beneath a drift of the snow. Rob Hall's widow, Jane Arnold, requested the mountaineers to let his body remain on the mountains, as that is where he always belonged to. After 27 years, Rob's body remains buried in the south summit to this day, reminding us of that tragic day. The pain of losing Rob Hall has been the worst for his wife and his newborn, Sarah Arnold. Jane was almost a mountaineer and climbed a lot of mountains with Rob. She was also supposed to climb Mount Everest for the second time with Rob, but since she was pregnant with Sarah, she had to abandon this expedition, only if she knew that this expedition would cost her husband's life. The tragic last ascent of Rob Edwin Hall serves as a reminder of the unforgiving nature of Mount Everest and the sacrifices made by those who pursue their dreams in extreme environments. Rob's selflessness and dedication to his team will forever be remembered, inspiring future generations of mountaineers. The 2023 climbing season on Mount Everest started like any other. Climbers from around the world gathered, seeking to conquer the formidable peak. However, nature had other plans in store. Unpredictable weather patterns and increasing challenges due to climate change pose significant threats. The three Sherpas named Dashari Sherpa, Lakpa Tendi Sherpa, and Lakpa Rita Sherpa were on their expedition to climb Mount Everest. The weather seemed quite fine in the beginning, and they were all ready to win over Everest and make it to the list of climbers of Mount Everest. Icefalls are pretty normal when it comes to the highest peak in the world. It is an ever-shifting landscape, mixed with ice and rocks, making it the deadliest situation. There have been countless stories where you would hear about some climber or Sherpa dying because of these unexpected icefalls. And the same happened with the unlucky three Sherpas from Nepal. It was before sunrise that the Sherpas left their base camp to fix the ropes and ascend Mount Everest. It's not that it was the first time that they were climbing any mountain, but when life doesn't want to give you chances, there is no way you can save yourself from what's coming next. The three Sherpas were all veterans of the Himalayas and had summited Mount Everest many times. This time, they were with a 25-person team from Imagine Nepal. The team was assigned to fix the ropes between Camp 2 at 6,400 meters to the 8,849-meter summit of Everest. It is one of the most important jobs of the Sherpas, as without ropes, it's almost impossible to climb any mountain. The team was trying to stay safe from the icefalls for a very long time, and they were successful too, but for a short period. The sun had risen, and they were crossing the so-called football field at around 7,500 meters. As the Sherpas were on their way, they saw a huge section of icefall just in the center. It was also one of the most exposed areas to falling seracs. The Sherpas decided to keep moving, as there was no way to stop when they were this close to the destination. But suddenly, at around 9:30 a.m., the radios of the base camp started giving bad news about an accident. It was said that the three Nepali Sherpas out of the team of 25 had been buried under the icefall, and they fall into the most dangerous part of Mount Everest. It was unclear what really happened because there were conflicting timelines. People had different views on what actually happened up there. Garrett Madison, the leader of Madison Mountaineering, expressed that there were a lot of reasons for what happened. He said that there was a collapse in the Khumbu icefall, and the hollow section of the glacier fell, and the icefall collapsed. According to Lakpa Norbu Sherpa, the Himalayan Rescue Association's coordinator, they were going via the Khumbu icefall when the avalanche occurred. Lakpa T Sherpas captured displays the avalanche that started on the west shoulder and finally reached the ice glacier below. Helicopters had been searching for the climbers, but Lakpa Norbu believed that there was little hope left because Shiri Sherpa, Tendi Sherpa, and Rita Sherpa were buried under several meters of rubble. But no one is sure if the video was filmed on the same day or if it was shot on the following day. The weather was getting worse minute by minute, and then there was news of another avalanche which led to a stop on the rescue operation to find the three Sherpas. It was assumed that they had fallen approximately 50 meters into a crevice before being brutally buried under ice and rocks. The rescue teams believe that even if the Sherpas were alive, there was no way to reach them. This happened to be the first deadly tragedy of the year 2023. Everest is said to be a very treacherous stretch, with every shifting glacier, which climbers have to navigate through snowstorms, which are always a danger for climbers. The next tragedy just happened 15 days after the last tragedy of Nepali Sherpas. It was on 1st May 2023 that we lost another enthusiastic climber to the mountains. Jonathan Sugarman, a passionate climber from the United States, was no stranger to adventure. With numerous successful summits to his name, he had gained a reputation as an accomplished mountaineer. Friends and fellow climbers admired his determination and humility. Jonathan was a 69-year-old retired doctor living in Seattle. He had a love for mountains and heights from an early age, but dropped the idea of becoming a mountaineer due to the risks that come with it. But again, in his 50s, he decided to give his then passion a try. He took his first trip to the mountains with one of his friends and developed his love for mountaineering again. In 2016, he climbed Cho Oyu, the 6th tallest peak in the world. There he suffered altitude sickness and abandoned the summit. But he didn't give up and hired a company to guide him through high altitude sickness. It looked as if this training for surviving high altitude sickness was successful because he was able to summon Aconcagua, based in Argentina. Just like this summit, he was able to climb many of the mountains, but his ultimate goal was to climb the giant Mount Everest. He planned to start his journey in April 2023. He traveled to the mountain early in the year with Washington-based international mountain guides. They planned to first acclimatize for at least a month and a half. Then they would summit in May or June. Since he was with the team for more than 3 years, they had built quite a good relationship with each other. Jonathan had brought his plastic trumpet along with him to practice. Jonathan was known for his jolly and whimsical nature. People around him were happy to have him there as he kept the environment light. After they arrived at the base camp, they decided to climb a few of the neighboring peaks to acclimatize. But there came a change in the plan as they decided to start climbing Mount Everest now. So in the last days of April, on one of the early mornings, they left for the summit from the base camp. They began the trek through the Khumbawa Eastfall, where 3 Nepali Sherpas lost their lives just 2 weeks back. The crew practiced on adjacent peaks for a week before mounting Everest on April 17th to begin acclimatizing trips to higher camps. On April 29th, the expedition departed Everest Base Camp for a second ascent to a higher height. Half of the team reached Camp 2, while others stayed at Camp 1. The remaining climbers arrived at Camp 2 on April 30th, intending to rest for a day before moving on to Camp 3 on May 2nd. The route was established properly, and they were eager to go high up as soon as possible. The team planned to spend the night in Camp 2 and get some rest before leaving for Camp 3. This was only supposed to be a routine acclimatization, as they were going to get back to the base camp after touching Camp 3. And this is a very common practice amongst mountaineers. But when things seemed to be going according to plan, a drastic change came. When the team reached Camp 2 at approximately 21,300 feet, Jonathan's health deteriorated. He began to get caught in the high altitude sickness. At this time, the team members felt helpless and could not do much to make him feel better. In Washington State, international peak guides prepared an expedition for Sugarman, who was making his second attempt to ascend the highest mountain in the world. The guiding company claims that his passing was not the result of a climbing accident or route condition that would have had an impact or safety concern on any other teams on the mountain. In a statement, the U.S. Embassy in Nepal said, "We can confirm that Dr. Jonathan Sugarman passed away on Monday, May 1st, while scaling Mount Everest. The high-altitude sickness came on him quite fast and hard, as if it didn't give other team members enough time to give him proper medical treatment." The rescue teams made attempts to bring back Jonathan's body to the base camp, but it was not possible as the circumstances didn't allow them. Jonathan is the 4th man to die on Mount Everest in the year 2023. This was a loss that put everyone in a deep shock. He was the first American to lose his life after Puey Liu, who passed away from exhaustion in 2021 after reaching Hillary Step, a location close to the main summit. Sugarman added the 20,310-foot Denali in Alaska and the 22,837-foot Aconcagua in Argentina to his impressive tally of peaks during his career. According to Uphill Athlete, he went mountain climbing in Ecuador in November 2021. He reportedly made it to the upper mountain ranges of the 19,347-foot Cotopaxi 18, 99-foot Cayambe, and 20,549-foot Chimborazo before turning back due to avalanche danger. Despite their best efforts, tragedy struck as an unexpected avalanche hit the team during their ascent. In that devastating moment, the mountaineering world lost a shining star. The news of Jonathan Sugarman's passing sent shockwaves through the community. Jonathan was more than just a skilled climber. He was a friend, mentor, and source of inspiration for all of us. He had a distinct way of inspiring others, always sharing positivity and a love of the mountains. As we conclude this tribute to Jonathan Sugarman and the 3 Nepali Sherpas, let us remember that the mountains are beautiful and wonderful, but they demand our utmost respect. May their adventurous soul rest in eternal peace, forever exploring new heights in the realms beyond. To all climbers out there, stay safe, stay vigilant, and cherish the bonds you form within the mountaineering community. Together, we can navigate the challenges of the mountains and continue to embrace the spirit of adventure that Jonathan Sugarman embodied. The death of George Mallory during the expedition to summit Everest in 1924 is one of the most enduring mysteries in mountaineering's history. A pioneer of mountaineering and a member of the first 3 British expeditions to summit Mount Everest, he's a legendary figure for climbers around the world. However, the mystery that shrouds his death still has experts puzzled about the details. Mallory was one of the members selected for the 1924 British Mount Everest expedition, led by Brigadier General Charles Bruce. Mallory had been a member of the 1922 British Mount Everest expedition 2 years prior, but all 3 attempts of the expedition to summit the highest mountain in the world had failed. He was chosen for the 1924 expedition due to his unwavering resolve and extensive mountaineering experience. He was accompanied by various well-respected mountaineers, such as Andrew Irvine, Howard Somerville, Edward Norton, and John DeVars Hazard. This expedition held extreme importance since, at the time, Everest had yet to be summited. However, the 1924 expedition had a rough start. General Bruce, the leader of the expedition, had to drop out due to malaria and cardiovascular problems. He had to leave for India, leaving the leadership role to Edward Norton. Norton appointed Mallory as a deputy leader, and the climb finally began. The first summit attempt was conducted by Mallory and his team member Jeffrey Bruce alongside 8 porters. The climb was to be done with oxygen, and the route for the climb was the North Ridge. Today, the North Ridge is known to be one of the hardest routes for summiting Everest. On June 1st, they set out from Camp 4. Their aim was to establish Camp 5 at the 25,500 feet elevation mark. The next step would have been to establish Camp 6 at an elevation of 27,200 feet. However, during their climb, they were exposed to harsh winds. 4 of the porters had already been exhausted during the ascent. Due to this, Mallory established Camp 5 at a lower elevation than he wanted to and sent 5 of the porters back. Now it was just Mallory, Bruce, and 3 porters. They decided to spend the night in Camp 5. In the morning, 2 of the remaining 3 porters also claimed to be sick. The climb would be impossible now with just 1 porter. So, the first attempt at summiting Everest of the 1924 expedition ended in failure. The team began their descent to North Col. Meanwhile, on 2nd June, a secondary party was on their way from Camp 4 to also make an attempt at summiting Everest. It consisted of the expedition members Howard Somerville, Edward Norton, and 6 porters. During their ascent, they met Mallory's party making their way down. Mallory's group told them that they had left the camps, sleeping bags, and some other supplies back in Camp 5. So, Somerville sent 2 of his porters back down with Mallory, as their load won't be needed anymore, thanks to the supplies waiting at Camp 5. Unfortunately, the summit attempt of Somerville and his team would also be cut short. They reached Camp 5 successfully. However, one of their porters could not continue and had to be sent back. The party continued on until they reached an elevation of 26,700 feet. Then another one of the remaining 3 porters, Simchumbi, could not continue due to his knee being swollen, causing his leg to go lame. The party decided to pitch their camp in a narrow cleft. Afterward, all the porters were sent back. The chances of summiting now were low, but Somerville and Norton decided to not give up. The pair reached an elevation of 28,000 feet. From here, Norton had to continue on alone as Somerville was struggling with a sore throat and severe cough. Norton kept moving forward and reached an altitude of 28,126 feet, the highest anyone had ever climbed on Everest at that time. Unfortunately, he had to abandon his attempt due to his visual impairment caused by the lack of oxygen. The duo made their way back, but during their descent, frostbite caused a slough from the mucous membrane lining Somerville's larynx to obstruct his air passageway. He could not breathe. So far away from help, he was nearing death. He had to clear away the obstruction no matter what. He pressed his own chest in an attempt to save his life. Luckily, the obstruction dislodged, and he could breathe again. Without stopping any longer than necessary, Somerville and Norton continued their descent after this horrifying experience and safely reached Camp 4, making the end of the expedition's second failed attempt. However, the mountaineers were not going to give up so easily. On 6 June, a third team began another summit attempt. The team consisted of Mallory, Irwin, and 8 porters. The attempt was to be made with supplementary oxygen for part of the climb. The weather was clear and optimal for a summit attempt. Of the 3 attempts, this one looked the most promising. They reached Camp 5, making good time. They sent 4 of their porters back with the news that the weather looked clear. The party of 6 slept in Camp 5 for the night. The next morning, they made their ascent to Camp 6 with no incidents. Once Mallory and Irwin reached Camp 6, they sent the remaining 4 porters back as well. With them, Mallory sent a note for Noel Odo and another note for John Noel. The porters met Odo at Camp 5 as he had made the ascent to support Mallory and Irwin. They gave him Mallory's note. Among other things, the note from Mallory asked for Odo to rescue his compass, which he had left back at Camp 5. Odo sent one of his sick porters back with the group to Camp 4, where they delivered their note to Noel. The note to Noel stated that Mallory was going to attempt to summit Everest in the early morning tomorrow. He asked Noel to look for them on the mountain using a telescope. Odo spent the night at Camp 5, and on the morning of 8 June, he made his way to Camp 6. On his way, he made a stop to conduct a geological study, during which he discovered the first definite fossils ever found on Everest. Afterward, Odo continued his ascent, reaching an elevation of around 26,000 feet. Here he found a small crag. He climbed it to a clear view of the summit ridge. However, the visibility was too low to see anything clearly. Suddenly, as if by magic, the atmosphere cleared up and the visibility improved. Odo could see the summit ridge and the peak of Everest in front of him. He looked closely and made out 2 tiny black spots on the ridge moving around. The 2 spots were definitely Mallory and Irwin making their climb. Then, just as quickly as the atmosphere had cleared, it became clouded again, and Odo could not see them any longer. Meanwhile, Noel and 2 porters were keeping a close eye to spot Irwin and Mallory during their ascent using their cameras and telescopes, but they looked in vain as neither Irwin nor Mallory could be spotted. The weather conditions worsened as Odo reached Camp 6. The wind picked up quickly, rushing through the cliffs. In these poor conditions, Odo climbed around 200 feet toward the summit from Camp 6. He began to make loud noises in the hopes that Irwin and Mallory could hear him and make their way back to camp if they were nearby, but they never came. Odo retreated to the camp, and by the time he reached it, the weather again cleared up. Still, no matter how hard he looked, there was no sign of Mallory or Irwin. Odo left Mallory's compass, which he had picked up from Camp 5, in the camp and descended back down to safety. The next day, on 9 June, Hazard and Odo used binoculars to look for signs of Irwin and Mallory near Camps 5 and 6, but neither could be seen. The situation looked dire. Odo quickly set out with 2 porters to make the climb up to Camp 6 once again. They reached Camp 5, where they spent the night. In the morning, Odo sent the 2 porters back as they couldn't continue the climb. He started his trek to Camp 6 alone. After arduous climbing, he found the camp. Its insides were just as he had left them the previous day. This spelled disaster, as it meant that Mallory and Irwin had not returned back, since there was no sign of them having spent the night in the camp. He climbed the path that Irwin and Mallory most likely took to make their ascent. He spent hours looking for the duo, to no avail. One man alone couldn't hope to conduct a thorough search. It would require a whole team. Saddened, Odo returned to Camp 6 and picked up 2 sleeping bags. He placed them in the form of a T. The T was a signal which Hazard saw from Camp 4. He understood that Mallory and Irwin were not found. Hazard, too, made a big cross sign on the snow using blankets. The sign delivered one single message to Noel at Camp 3: death. This is how Norton, the expedition leader, was informed of what had happened. He ordered a signal to be sent back, abandoned all hope in return. Otto took Mallory's compass once again, this time from Camp 6, and made his way back down to Camp 4. Irwin and Mallory were dead, their body lost to the treacherous Everest. A memorial cairn was made at the base camp to memorialize the expedition for future generations. The expedition was over, and the team departed base camp on 15 June. Ruth, the wife of Mallory, and their 3 children were informed of his death soon afterward. This incident was a great loss for the family and for the mountaineering community. The search for Mallory's and Irwin's bodies would be a long one. Various attempts at a search were made, with none being successful. That is until a new piece of information emerged. In 1979, Wang Hanbao, a Chinese climber, found a body while climbing Everest during a walk around his camp. He buried it in the snow where he found it. However, he only told his team that he had found an English body. He did not tell them where he found the body, and no one went to look for it. An avalanche the very next day killed Wang Hanbao and 2 other climbers. Going off this key piece of information, a search was conducted in 1986, near where Wang Hanbao and his team had made camp. The body of Mallory was finally found during the search 75 years after his death. It was deduced from the rope jerk injuries that Mallory had fallen and broken his leg. Soon after, he died. His body lay preserved by the cold for decades. The search party covered the body in stones to protect it from the birds and performed a burial ceremony. It is unclear if Mallory summited Everest or not. No conclusion can be drawn on this due to the lack of evidence. Mallory rests on Everest to this day. On the mountain, he made the brave attempt to summit.